Have you heard of the Human Rights of the Child? And how many of you heard of the Convention on the Rights of the Child? Now let me go through what I mean by the human rights of children and give you a little background to this. And also then I will go and give you a little background to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Human rights were originally considered to belong to the jurisdiction of a country. Yet, the international community experienced innumerable extreme and grave violations of human rights during the Second World War. This prompted the international community to establish a mechanism to protect human beings and to establish world order. Never again would people be subjected to such grave violations, was the overwhelming intent. And as a result, in 1945, the United Nations was born as an intergovernmental organization with the sole purpose of preventing future generations from such violations. And I'm sure some of you have heard in 1948, the Universal of Human Rights Declaration was adopted by the United Nations. It is considered the milestone achievement of the 20th century by international community. It established the concept of fundamental human rights as inherent, universal, and to be upheld and protected by all nations. Human rights were considered universal, inalienable, independent, and equal and non-discriminatory. Protecting children and their rights was not the primary intent of the UDHR, although it did contain a provision of social protection for children and the provision regarding free and compulsory elementary education. Human rights is the only system of values that are universally recognized. It provides minimum standards and procedural rules for human relations. But of most importance is the importance it places on the obligation of the countries. Now, each country has the obligation to prevent violations and to respect, protect, and promote human rights. And under these human rights instruments, there has to be a section for remedies. Now, the Convention on the Rights of the Child emerged in 1989. The international community thought that the UDHR was not enough to protect the human rights of people, and so after that, many international human rights instruments started to emerge, and these instruments are internationally binding. For those countries that have ratified these, it becomes very binding, and they have to comply to this. So in 1989, November 20th, a Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted by consensus. It bore significance in bringing about a significant paradigm shift in viewing children simply as objects of charity and welfare to individuals with rights. This new treaty is the first comprehensive treaty of its kind, and it entered into force in 1990. It is the strongest international legal framework for children and is considered the final product of international efforts in setting norms and standards for the promotion and protection of children and their rights. The CRC provides a new vision of children to the international community. Children are specified as human beings who are the subject of their own rights, just as adults. The child, by reason of his physical, mental immaturity, needs special safeguards and care, including appropriate legal protection, as well before and as well as after birth. This is stated in the preamble. The Convention has 42 substantive provisions. It covers a full range of rights, a full range meaning economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights. And it reached universal consensus. And what was very amazing is that for the first time, the international community decided on a universal definition of the child. Now, I don't know how many of you know what the universal definition of the child is, but for many of us, we thought a child was a very young child in elementary school years. No, the international community decided that a child is defined as anyone under the age of 18. Also, the CRC puts a legal status on children and capacity to exercise their rights as addressed in the convention. And the full rights, as I said, the 42 substantive provisions of the rights. And each country has the right and the responsibility to respect the responsibilities, rights and claims and duties of parents, or, where applicable, members of the extended family or community, and as provided by the local customs, the legal guardians, or other persons legally responsible for the child. And another interesting concept of the CRC is the evolving capacities of the child. Appropriate direction and guidance in the exercise by the child of their rights is recognized in this convention according to their evolving capacities. So in essence, the child is not seen as a static individual, but the child has different evolving capacities. The convention has 3 optional protocols. The optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict, and the optional protocol on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. And there's another optional protocol to the CRC on the communication procedures. Now, I said that the Convention on the Rights of the Child has almost reached a universal ratification, which means that 196 countries of the world have ratified this convention, meaning that they will abide by this international human rights instruments. They are making a commitment to the world that we will abide this instrument, and they're also making a commitment to their own children that we will incorporate this into the law of the land. The 3 optional protocols, the protocol on armed conflict currently to date has 166 ratifications, and the second optional protocol on sale of children has 173, and the third one has 31 ratifications. So you can see that how many countries of the world have ratified the convention as well as its optional protocols. But let's wait for a moment. But what's happening to the lives of children? We're seeing so many cases where heinous violations and crimes are being committed against children, or different countries are not living up to their responsibilities to protect their own children or children living in their jurisdiction. Until the CRC says everybody who is under the 18, who are born with basic fundamental inherent rights, and all actions are to be taken in the best interests of the child. For instance, all decisions regarding that children or all decisions that may have impact directly or indirectly on children should be considered with the best interest of the child. And moreover, the convention specifies that every child has a right to be heard, meaning it's not just having their opinions said and adults listening to it, but it means that their views must be duly considered. For instance, in divorce cases, some courts and in some countries, the judges will have to listen to the child as to who they would like to live with. It is the child who has to take part in the decision-making process of every decision that is being made on their behalf or for them. And of course, the convention stipulates that it is the right of the child to be free from all forms of violence, and also it is the right of the child to have protection from all forms of violence. So I'm not going to go into all the other aspects of the convention, but the ones that are very pertinent to our field, the field of child protection or prevention of child abuse and neglect. There's the four very general principles that are overarching principles of the convention, are the following four articles or provisions: the provision for non-discrimination, the best interests of the child, life, survival, and development, and the respect for the child's view. All rights are indivisible and interdependent, providing for a holistic and avoiding hierarchy of rights. The adoption of CRC, as I mentioned, provided a paradigm shift, but until recently, the field of child protection had considered child maltreatment as a family private issue, a criminal issue, and a medical or public health issue, rather than as a child rights issue. However, taken as a whole, the rights of the child have to intersect with child protection for the harmonious development of the child. Article 19, paragraph 1, is a very important article that addresses the issue of child abuse and neglect, or prevention of child abuse and neglect. Let me read you this article. There are two different paragraphs. It says states parties meaning states or countries that are party to the convention, shall take all appropriate legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures to protect the child from all forms of physical or mental violence, injury or abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, maltreatment or exploitation, including sexual abuse, while in the care of parents, legal guardian, and any other person who has the care of the child. The second paragraph goes on to say, such protective measures should, as appropriate, include effective procedures for the establishment of social programs to provide necessary support for the child and for those who have the care of the child, as well as for the other forms of prevention and for identification, reporting, referral, investigation, treatment, and follow-up of instances of child maltreatment described as above, and for judicial involvement. Now, we must look at Article 19 in relation to its four general principles. As I said, non-discrimination, respect for the views of the child, for the right of the child for right to development, and also the best interest of the child. Most of the provisions of the CRC directly and indirectly puts an obligation on countries to prohibit violence against children. So in essence, the onus falls on the country to assist families and parents to better raise their child. There's so many articles relevant to violence throughout the convention. Let me just go through some. Well, briefly go through them. Relevant articles, as I said, to the evolving capacities are pretty relevant. You know, how should you discipline your child? How should you reason with your child, according to the evolving capacities of the child? And children, there should be a guarantee of non-separation from the parents unless there is evidence of child abuse or neglect. There should be assistance for child rearing responsibilities. Parents should be given some assistance. There should be an abolishment of harmful practices. Harmful practices, in many cases, are corporal punishment, child marriage, forced marriage, honor killings, FGM, infanticide, all kinds of practices that are used in different regions and different societies. The adequate standard of living. What is an adequate standard of living? A child should have at least basic sanitation, basic nutrients. These are all adequate standard of living, and this is the responsibility of the state. If the parents cannot provide this, it is the country that needs to develop its social security or safety nets so that children will be provided with adequate standard of living. School discipline, child labor, sexual exploitation, prevention of abduction or trafficking, and we have the torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or capital punishment. You know, in many countries, children have capital punishment. There still exists capital punishment. There's still inhumane and degrading treatment. Children get flogged for certain crimes, and in some countries, children still are executed for a crime they committed while they were a child. Have you heard of this phrase, no violence against children is justifiable? All violence against children is preventable? Well, back in 2002 and 2003, the international community, well, the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the UN, we were very alarmed at the scope and the magnitude and the extent of the child maltreatment. And so the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is the body, the treaty body that monitors compliance to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, decided to conduct or to ask the General Assembly to appoint an independent expert to do a global study on violence against children. And Dr. Sergio Pinheiro was appointed as the independent expert, and he undertook a study for 2 years. We went through extensive questionnaires and had many countries throughout the world, Northern and Southern Hemisphere, participate in this. And his report was first released in 2006 and was presented to the General Assembly of the United Nations. What he found was that, in conclusion, what he found was no violence against the child or children was justifiable, and that all violence was preventable. Freedom from violence, as I said earlier, is a right, and children have to be respected and treated with dignity. We often forget that the child is a human being with dignity, and how do we treat people with dignity is to treat them as a human being, as a fellow human being, living together in this world. There are in many countries, there are rules and there are very harsh sanctions for torturing animals. But there hasn't really been that much interest on what about the child. And everybody in the past thought, well, it's a family business and it's disciplining for the child because we want the child to be a better citizen. But in essence, we were really forgetting about the dignity of the child. This UN study found what was alarming was that regardless of income, regardless of the socioeconomic status of families or the development of each different country, regardless of the educational level, regardless of religion, regardless of whatever, it was found these 5 main settings where child abuse and neglect, where violence against the child was pervasive. It was found to be pervasive in the home and the family, the school and the educational settings, in the work settings, in the community, and in the justice system. Justice system meaning children in care or children who have come in conflict with the law and protective care and welfare systems too. And the issue of violence against children was that no violence against children was justifiable. How do you justify flogging a child in the justice system? How do you justify burning a child because the child has not obeyed the parents? This study came out with 12 recommendations, overarching recommendations, and of course it presented an urgent call to action. Well, this was in 2006. Well, 5 years on, the NGO community looked into how well the world was listening to the recommendations and how well the countries had established legislations, policies, administrative measures, etc., to eradicate violence against children. And it was found that not much has happened, not much has changed in the 5 years. So, 196 countries that have ratified the convention. When you ratify an international treaty instrument, you can say, well, we're not sure if we can fully implement a certain article. So they can put in a reservation to that particular article. But to my knowledge, not one of the 196 countries that have ratified this convention had put a reservation to Article 19 that relates to abuse and neglect. But let's look at what's happening in the world, in the family, in the school, in the community, in the care system, and in the educational system. Well, in the school, let me go a little bit into the school system. Article 28, paragraph 2, states that the school should take all appropriate measures to ensure that school discipline is administered in a manner consistent to the child's human dignity and in conformity with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But we know that corporal punishment is exercised in schools, in many schools throughout the world, in every society. Although this particular article, not many countries have, to my knowledge, not any country has put a reservation to this particular article. But yet we have corporal punishment being pervasive and being allowed in schools. But of course people have put some provisions like reasonable. But what is reasonable? In whose views is reasonable? It's very subjective when you say reasonable. the greatest message I would like to send is that countries should adopt policies and laws to first prohibit child maltreatment and also to prevent child maltreatment. We know that why does so much violence or child maltreatment happen in the family? Well, because many times parents are not too equipped with appropriate positive child rearing practices, or parents are going through their own troubling situations, or there's something that is pathological about the parents, or there is financial issues. And so this is the responsibility of the country to assist families to become better parents. Violence against children is associated with harmful practices. As I said earlier, there's some traditional practices where for generations and for centuries, it was very customary. Sometimes in some countries, when a child goes through menarche or has their period, they have to sit out in a hut for the whole week, not be allowed in the home, etc. Or there's female genital mutilation, FGM. Okay. Another element that is associated with child maltreatment is poverty. In poor situations, when parents are not equipped with all the resources, this may lead to child maltreatment or child violence. Sexual exploitation is the worst forms of violence, and ILO, International Labor Organization, also has a convention that deals with worst forms of labor, which includes sexual exploitation, child soldiering, etc. Child labor is another issue. We hear of children who are working in quarries, in agricultural fields, in tobacco plantations, in cotton plantations, in torching heat, exposed to all kinds of toxic pesticide, toxic chemicals. And of course, this is related to poverty, but it's related to also other social issues such as cheap labor. And when business companies would like to make profit, what do? They want to hire cheap labor, and children are they prey victims to cheap labor. Child marriage. We hear about. Well, I was just reading about New York. Now, Governor Cuomo said that he will do something about child marriage. Even in the U.S., children are getting married early, at an early age, 16 and 17. Well, under the definition of CRC, a child is 18, and we advocate that children, girls and boys, together equally, should not marry before the age of 18. And others, consequently, child protection has slowly expanded beyond child survival to a broader protection of child's human dignity, well-being, health, and development. Now, the convention has, as I said, 41 substantive articles. And sometimes when treaties are negotiated, they become very vague because it goes through extensive negotiations, and different countries, different religions, different legal circumstances really do not allow for very detailed provisions. And sometimes it becomes very vague for countries to comply and implement. So what the Committee on the Rights of the Child has done is to provide general comments. General comments are the highest authoritative interpretation of rights and provisions of the Convention. And to date, there are 20 general comments. The Committee on the Rights of the Child started to exist from 1991. So within about 26 years, the committee has come up with 20 general comments. There's 2 general comments that I would like to draw your attention to. The one is the general comment on corporal punishment. The aim of this general comment was to raise awareness of the harmful impact on children and to prohibit corporal punishment in family and other settings. Now, in other settings, I mean in all the 5 settings that transpired out of the UN Global Study. Corporal punishment is defined as any punishment which physical force is used, and it's intended to cause some degree of pain or discomfort, however light. And these are some of the various acts and behaviors that are included under corporal punishment: humiliating, pulling hair, shaking, throwing, hitting, scratching, belittling, pinching. Then there's another general comment that is directed to Article 19 of the CRC, and it is related to child protection. And as I said earlier, child protection requires a paradigm shift towards respecting and promoting the human dignity and the physical and psychological integrity of children as rights-bearing individuals, rather than perceiving them primarily as victims. This general comment, let me give you a little background history to this. In 2008, we had several discussions of the necessity of this general comment, and it emerged at the launch of a global summit on protecting children from violence, abuse, and neglect of ISPCAN, in cooperation with ISPCAN. And with the close cooperation of ISPCAN and the International Institute for Child Rights and Development, and through a broad consultation and participation among among all stakeholders, the committee proceeded to develop this general comment. Every time we develop a particular general comment, we go through extensive consultations throughout different regions, and we also solicit input from children and the young people. So we wanted to come up with a general comment that will have the potential to transform current child protection policies to embrace the human rights imperative. So ISPCAN was instrumental in helping the Committee on the Rights of the Child to lay out the guidance to countries on how to prevent, eradicate, and address the issues of violence against violence against children. And it stresses the concept of dignity, which requires that every child is recognized, respected, and protected as a rights holder and as a unique and valuable human beings with an individual personality, distinct needs, interests, and privacy. Well, we forget that every child is different. And I'm sure if you're working in the field, you know that children are different. If you're a parent, you know different. Your 2 different children have different personalities. But in essence, we in the society, in the school systems, we kind of lump them together and think that children are all children. Each child has very different needs and interests, and we have to respect the privacy of the child. Sometimes we don't respect the privacy. And you know, when I get very appalled astonished when I see in preschools, and I know that it doesn't happen all the time, but for younger toddler classes, the preschool teacher will undress or change the diaper of the child in front of another child. Now we forget that that little toddler has his or her own privacy to be respected. And in general comment number 13, we stress that the child is a holder and as a unique and valuable human being. The principle of the rule of law should apply fully to children as it does to adults. It provides definitions of various forms of violence against children, including neglect. Well, now, let me go. Have you seen this picture? It startled everyone. It really amazed the world. This is Alan Kurdi. It happened 2 years ago. We forget the images of this picture. But he's not the only one. Since this photo went viral, there's been scores more children who've drowned in the Mediterranean or in other places because they were escaping violence, because they were escaping from persecution in their home country. They were taken to the sea and they had drowned. Okay? Crossing seas, and because countries would not accept them and pushbacks. This was not the only case. Some of us have seen this. The little boy, look at him, just completely traumatized from bombings. I'm not even going to name the countries of this case because we all know where this happened. Who's responsible? Now, you would say, well, this was not a maltreatment that a parent caused or a teacher caused, etc. But, as I said earlier, and I would like to stress this, it is the country's responsibility to protect the children. Now, if every individual countries do not protect their children, or in the international world, where is humanity when countries do not accept migrant boats? Because, of course, we do understand that it does put a lot of burden on countries if there's an influx of people coming in. But when they have to escape a country because of persecution, because of bombing, because of chemical acid, chlorine use, we can't, as fellow brothers and sisters, cannot just close our eyes or turn our heads. Now, this is the kind of work that I would like us, who are in child protection, to do more advocacy work. And I know some of you do work with emergency relief that is dispatched to other parts of the world for this. But what will happen? We all know what research tells us, that the sequelae, the consequences of trauma, of child abuse and neglect, will become very taxing to the society in the future. But currently the world has turned into a very, very hostile environment for the child. Now, I think if there was another UN study, I would say we would go further than saying violence is pervasive in communities. I would say the violence is pervasive in international spheres too, because people are not accepting refugees, or people because we're not addressing immediately to these immediate disasters too. This is graphic. I don't like to use photos of children. This is one I took personally from a region where children, there's a group of population that's probably the most persecuted population in the 21st century. This little boy was thrown into a fire, and the mother went in and saved the child. And you can see the scars. It happened about 3-4 months ago. The scar here is probably more of a deep scar. It must have been a deeper burn, and the scabs are still on. Another one was another picture of a boy thrown into a fire, and these burn scars because his clothes had burnt into his skin. And this is the front view of him. And to survive this and to escape, cross the border, cross the river to another country to take refuge. This is the worst kind of violence against children that we're seeing now in this world. Now, I'd like to say this is what, in 2006, at the end of his report, Dr. Sergio Pinheiro said, children are tired of being called our future. Every country has this phrase, every society has this phrase that children are future leaders or future. Children are tired of words and no action. They want to enjoy their childhoods free of violence now. And this quote has been quoted so many times, and it really says a lot, doesn't it? They want to enjoy their life free of violence because it is the right of the child to be free of violence. Well, I think my time is up, or at least almost up, exactly, and I will entertain some questions.
Great. Thank you, Yanghee, for a really great overview of the entire CRC program and some clear examples of where we still have so much left to do in this area. So I have a couple of questions for you. One comment someone has made is whether you would be available for people to contact you following the webinar with some specific questions. There is one woman who is working in Colombia and would like your input on some training that she's doing in her work there. So,
okay, on my slide, on my last slide, I have my email address and my Twitter account. So please, I'm available. Thank you. I'd be delighted.
That's great. Okay, so we'll take a couple of more questions. One of them is, in the optional protocol that was developed by the CRC, there were some guidelines that you mentioned that were created for child pornography. Did any of those protocols cover online, or what we are now seeing as a lot of internet-related violence? Did any of them touch on that and some of the current issues that we are facing now?
That optional protocol really didn't go into cyberbullying or ICT, because when that was being developed in 2000, the ICT and cyberbullying was not really prominent, was not really that active. But henceforth, the committee has developed, did a day of general discussion on the cyber and the use of ICT. And I think this is an area that's a new and emerging area that potentially the Committee on the Rights of the Child would have to come up with a general comment. However, in this general comment number 13, we have a whole section on the cyber bullying and cyber space.
Okay, great.
And we see, if I may, we see child pornography is the most lucrative business, and we have tried to include in many cases comics. In many countries they use comics, and that gives you the image that it's an imagery of a child, and in some countries they use pornography. Well, of course they use adults dressed up as kids. And these are some issues that are new and emerging that is very concerning. and is being dealt with under the CRC.
Okay, great. So we have a couple of other questions. Sometimes the pictures are certainly worth 1,000 words and are the most impactful when we are trying to make a point of some of the crimes against children. However, is there any issue about providing or sharing pictures, if we do have access to them, of injured children regarding consent that we should be aware of?
Yes. When I took the last two pictures, well, I have more pictures, but I've asked the parents if I can use this. But of course, you know, parents really may not have gone through and thought through what that meant. So it'd be important for us, if we want to use some pictures where you don't take it from front view, where you can't identify the child, or not to be so explicit. There's one photo that the boy with burns, the legs, on top of his belly, there's a protrusion, and I thought it was a tumor, but it's really because his clothing burnt into it, and it looks almost like the size of an egg. And I have a photo, but I couldn't show it. Well, of course, his hand is covering his private parts, but still, these would be too explicit. But try to find pictures that will not be able to, that people can't identify the victim's actual face.
Yeah, because in some ways they are important testimonial as well, and they are able to really show the extent of the crimes against children that words simply don't suffice.
Right.
So I think it's important to learn how to utilize these effectively. So is there an option to deal with special situations, for instance, with handicapped children and rights of children who are institutionalized at hospitals? Are there any special provisions, I guess is the question, in situations like that where a child is not in a normal home situation? Are there additional provisions for those circumstances?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at Article General Comment 13, it deals a bit with that too. And there's another international convention for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And in CRC, we also have Article 23 that deals with children with disabilities. And let me give you a little bit of an explanation that when you become a party to this convention, there's a 5-year reporting cycle, and every 5 years, but of course there's a backlog, and it'll take more than 5 years, a country has to come in front of the committee and submit their report, and it takes for 6 hours. It takes a whole day to review to examine their country progress. And of course, we receive a lot of reports from NGOs and other UN and international agencies dealing with that particular country. Mm-hmm. And since there is an article on children and disabilities in institutional and care facilities, we review these. In some cases, I won't name names, children are locked up. Of course, we still see them chained. And in another country, we've even had a recommendation for that country to close down that care facility because of the violent violence that was committed to these children.
Mm-hmm. Along those lines, when a country is found to have gross, infractions of the CRC, what enforcement or what sanctions or penalties are available, and what, in terms of making sure that countries do adhere to these guidelines, what teeth are there in these rules?
Well, that's the sad part. that it's really not that binding. But now many countries do realize that the naming and shaming is really very, very critical for them. And in the international arena, there's a lot of naming and shaming. And if the concluding observations are published online. And there's other mechanisms through the human rights system. It's called the special rapporteur, the special procedures. I'm now currently acting as a special rapporteur on the human rights situation of Myanmar. And we make country visits, we make fact-finding missions, and we really impress on the government and do our reporting. And it's a shaming process for the different countries. For disabilities and violence against children and violence against women, there's special rapporteurs who do these country visits and bring them up to the fore.
Okay, very interesting, because some of that is not clear unless you're on the inside to understand what the process is.
Mm-hmm. And the third option of protocol, the individual communications, that was developed just so that the child or their guardian and the child can put a communication to the international organization, like the Committee on the Rights of the Child, after they have exhausted the national mechanism.
Okay, that's very interesting. And are all of these documents publicly available?
Yes, yes, publicly available.
On the UN website?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great.
You may want to go to Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, ohchr.org, that deals with human rights issues.
Okay, great. One last question I think we have time for, and then we're going to have to wrap it up, is let me see. Okay, if people would like to see what is happening at a country level in terms of programs and things that are being implemented in different regions or in a specific country, what is the best way to get information on programs that are related to different aspects of the CRC guidelines? Is there any one place where that is centralized?
Not one place. UNICEF comes out with State of the World reports every year, and UNICEF, their mandate is to implement CRC. So that would be the closest venue. Okay. Then we have the Child Rights International Network, CRIN. I think it's CRIN.org. It's a great network, and if you go into their site, it goes through different themes and different countries. And it goes through, and it also publishes NGO reports relating to that particular country when that country was being considered for examination.
Okay, great. Well, I would just like to take a minute and thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for your time and your wisdom and for sharing all of your experience and the history of the CRC, because it does give us perspective and where we've come from and where we're going in terms of what's left to be done around child's rights. So thank you so much for taking the time today to join us and host this webinar. And on behalf of ISPCAN, I want to thank all of our attendees for joining today. We encourage you to look into membership at ISPCAN if you are a multidisciplinary professional working in this field. We have lots of programs that would support your work and provide you some mentorship and guidance in your career. So we encourage you to look into ISPCAN membership. And following this presentation, the recording of this webinar will be available online on our website. And again, I'd like to just remind you that the handouts of Dr. Lee's slides are available in the menu on the right-hand side. and they are available for you to download. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon at another webinar in our series. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Take care.